The doors of the Redemption Creek courthouse burst open so hard that the brass hinges shrieked against the morning heat, and every man and woman inside turned to see who had the audacity to interrupt a murder trial already 3 days into its bloody testimony. The judge's gavel came down once, twice, 3 times, and still the echo of those heavy doors swallowed the sound whole. Because standing in the threshold, boots caked in red Arizona dust, hat tipped back with the unhurried confidence of a man who had ridden 200 miles in under 4 days, was Peter Rourke, and every soul in that room who had a secret felt the cold press of it against their chest the moment his gray eyes swept the crowd. The prosecutor, a thin-lipped man named Gerald Ashcroft, rose halfway from his chair before thinking better of it. The jury of 12 shifted in their creaking wooden seats. And at the defense table, hands bound at the wrist with rope, because the county had not seen fit to afford her shackles, Myrtle Fairchild looked up from the scarred tabletop, where she had been staring for the better part of 2 hours, and something cracked open behind her dark eyes that she had been keeping locked tight for 3 days. Peter Rourke walked down the center aisle of that courtroom like he owned every plank beneath his boots. He was not a small man. He was not a quiet man by nature. But what silenced every whisper in the packed gallery was not his size, or the low-slung revolver at his hip, or even the leather satchel he carried in his left hand. It was the absolute certainty in his face. The kind of certainty that came from a man who had looked at every ugly piece of a puzzle and decided he would rearrange the entire table before he let an innocent woman hang. He stopped 3 feet from the judge's bench, pulled off his hat, and set the leather satchel on the railing with a sound like a gavel strike of its own. "Your Honor," Peter Rourke said, and his voice was the kind of low and steady that carries through stone. "My name is Peter Rourke, and I have ridden from Tucson to present evidence in the matter of the Territory versus Myrtle Fairchild." He let the silence stretch for exactly 1 heartbeat before he delivered the words that would be repeated in saloons and parlors and churches from Redemption Creek to the Colorado border for the next 40 years. "Every lie told about her was something I can now disprove." The gasps were audible. Gerald Ashcroft's chair scraped back. 2 jurors leaned forward. And Myrtle Fairchild, who had not cried once in 3 days of testimony accusing her of a crime she did not commit, pressed her bound hands to her mouth and let out a single breath that sounded like the first breath of someone who had been drowning. To understand how a man like Peter Rourke came to ride 4 days through desert and scrubland to stand in a dusty courthouse and stake everything on a woman he had known for barely 4 months, you had to go back to the spring of 1883, to the day Myrtle Fairchild stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek with a carpet bag in one hand and a letter of employment in the other, and discovered that everything she had been promised was built on a foundation of sand. Redemption Creek, Arizona Territory, in the spring of 1883 was a town in the middle of deciding what it wanted to be. The silver mine on the eastern ridge had made 3 men very wealthy and 100 others moderately comfortable, and that money had begun to call in a different class of person: lawyers and land speculators, and men who wore their ambition like a second skin. The original settlers, the ranchers and the blacksmiths and the women who had built something real in the dust, watched the newcomers with the quiet wariness of people who had survived things that could not be put into a newspaper. Myrtle Fairchild was 24 years old, and she had come from Kansas City after the death of her father. A school teacher had left her with his books, his debts, and a stubborn refusal to be defeated by either. She had answered an advertisement placed in the Kansas City Courier by a man named Harold Beaumont, who was seeking an educated woman to serve as a bookkeeper and secretary for the Beaumont Mercantile and Land Office in Redemption Creek, Arizona Territory. The salary was generous, the letter was formal and respectable, and Myrtle had packed everything she owned into 1 carpet bag and boarded the first stage heading southwest. She stepped off that stage on a Thursday morning in late April, when the desert air still carried the faint, cool memory of winter, and the first thing she noticed was that The Beaumont Mercantile and Land Office was the largest building on the main street, freshly painted white with green shutters, which was the kind of detail that a person notices when they are trying very hard not to notice that the man waiting to greet her was looking at her not like an employer, but like a commodity he had ordered from a catalog. Harold Beaumont was 47 years old, thick across the shoulders with a silver watch chain stretched across a considerable midsection, and eyes the color of dirty river water. He shook her hand with both of his and smiled the smile of a man who was very accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Miss Fairchild," he said, "welcome to Redemption Creek. I think we're going to get along just beautifully." Myrtle had survived enough of the world by that point to recognize the shape of a trap before she stepped into it. She set her carpet bag down and looked at Harold Beaumont with the direct, steady gaze her father had taught her was the only appropriate response to a man who underestimated you, and said, "Mr. Beaumont, I was hired as a bookkeeper and secretary. I'd like to begin by reviewing the accounts." It was not what he had expected her to say. The smile flickered. Then it came back, slightly recalibrated. "Of course," he said. She moved into the small room above the mercantile that served as her accommodations, unpacked her father's books and her own careful ledgers, and within a week had discovered two things: that Harold Beaumont's accounts were a masterpiece of creative dishonesty, and that half the town of Redemption Creek was either too afraid or too indebted to say anything about it. She was not afraid. That was her great flaw, and it was also her great strength. Peter Rourke first saw Myrtle Fairchild on a Friday afternoon in early May, standing in the doorway of Beaumont's Mercantile with a ledger book tucked under her arm, and an expression on her face that suggested she had just discovered something that outraged her deeply, and was deciding how best to act on that outrage. He was riding through Redemption Creek on his way to nowhere in particular, which was a description that fit most of his life in those years. He was 29 years old, tall and lean with dark hair that needed cutting, and the permanent squint of a man who spent most of his hours in bright sun. He was known in certain parts of the territory as a man who could be hired to find things that were lost, or locate people who didn't want to be located, or solve problems that required someone willing to go to places where the law either couldn't or wouldn't reach. He was not, technically, an outlaw, but he had ridden close enough to that line for long enough that the distinction had become somewhat philosophical. He had no particular reason to stop in Redemption Creek. He stopped anyway. He tied his horse to the hitching post outside Dawson's General Store, which was the smaller and significantly more honest competitor to Beaumont's Mercantile, and went in to buy coffee and hard tack and a new box of cartridges. And the owner, a cheerful Irishman named Cormac Dawson, told him entirely without being asked that the new bookkeeper up at Beaumont's place had already found discrepancies in accounts going back 3 years, and that Harold Beaumont was walking around looking like a man with a severe stomachache. "She bowled?" Peter asked, not particularly because he cared, but because Cormac Dawson had a gift for storytelling, and it seemed rude to interrupt the flow. "Bowled." Cormac set both hands flat on the counter. "Son, I watched that woman tell Harold Beaumont to his face in front of 4 witnesses that she would not falsify a single figure in his books, and that if he asked her again she would report him to the territorial auditor. Harold Beaumont has not been told no by anyone in this county in 15 years. Peter found himself deeply interested in his coffee tin for a moment. Then he said, "What did Beaumont do?" "Smiled," Cormac said. "Which is worse, if you ask me. He met Myrtle Fairchild formally that same afternoon. He had wandered down the street to water his horse at the trough outside the livery stable, and she was coming out of the post office with a stack of envelopes and the particular focused walk of someone with somewhere to be, and they arrived at the corner of Main Street and Copper Lane at exactly the same moment from opposite directions. She sidestepped left. He sidestepped left. She went right. He went right. He put out a hand to steady her stack of envelopes and somehow ended up holding 2 of them while she held the rest, and they looked at each other from a distance of approximately 8 inches, and Peter Rourke, who was not a man easily unsettled, felt something shift in his chest that had no precedent in his experience. "I'm sorry," he said. "We both stepped the same direction," she said. "It's an equal fault." She held out her hand for the envelopes. "Though I'd appreciate those back since they're mine." He handed them over. He watched her sort them back into her stack with the brisk efficiency of someone who had grown up treating time like the precious resource it was. She glanced up and caught him watching. "You're staring," she said, not unkindly. "I am," he admitted. "I apologize. My name is Peter Rourke." Myrtle Fairchild. She studied him for a moment with those dark eyes, taking inventory the way she probably took inventory of accounts, noting what was there and what was conspicuously absent. Whatever she concluded, she nodded once, as if filing it under a category she hadn't decided to name yet. "Are you passing through?" That was the plan. Was. He didn't have an answer to that. He tipped his hat and stepped aside, and she walked past him with her envelopes, and he stood on the corner of Main Street and Copper Lane for a full minute before he turned and walked back to Dawson's General Store to ask if there was a room to let anywhere in town. He told himself he stayed because Redemption Creek had the feel of a place where something was about to crack open, and men in his profession did well in towns where things were cracking open. He told himself that for about 2 weeks, and then he stopped lying to himself and admitted that he stayed because of Myrtle Fairchild, though what specifically it was about her that had rooted him to the town like a fence post he could not have articulated with any precision. It was partly the boldness Cormac Dawson had described. It was partly the way she spoke to him when they met again, at the church social on the 3rd Sunday of May, where he had appeared mainly out of the social guilt of being seen in a town long enough that people started expecting you to show up at things. She was standing near the lemonade table, which was the traditional gathering point for people who did not particularly want to be at church socials but had come out of obligation, and he found himself standing near it for the same reason, and they exchanged the polite nod of two people who have recognized a common feeling. "You're still here," she said. "So are you," he replied. "I live here," she said. "What's your reason?" "I'm working on one," he said, and she laughed genuinely, without covering her mouth the way women were expected to. A laugh that started somewhere real and came out that way. He handed her a cup of lemonade he had just poured, which she took without the performative protest that politeness usually demanded, and they stood together at that lemonade table for the next 2 hours and talked about things that had nothing to do with small talk. She told him about her father, the school teacher, and the books he had left her, and the particular sadness of inheriting someone's whole world in volumes. He told her about the years he had spent working for a man named Samuel Cord, tracking stolen cattle and missing persons across 4 territories, and the year he had spent after Cord's death working alone, which had been instructive in ways he hadn't anticipated. "What does it teach you," she asked, "working alone? What you actually need," he said, "versus what you thought you needed." She was quiet for a moment, turning her lemonade cup in her hands. Then she said, "I think I would find it lonely." "I found it clarifying," he said, "until recently." She looked at him sidelong, and he could see her deciding whether to pursue what he meant, and deciding against it, at least for now, with the patience of someone who understood that things revealed themselves in their own time if you didn't yank at them. He found reasons to be on Main Street when she walked to the post office. He sat in on town meetings about water rights and land claims where she sat across the room, methodically taking notes while men twice her age talked over each other. He learned that Redemption Creek had 3 layers: the surface layer of ordinary commerce, the middle layer of Harold Beaumont's financial maneuvering, and the deep layer of something older and more dangerous that Beaumont was part of but did not entirely control. He learned these things the way he had always learned things, by asking questions of the people who were not considered important enough to lie to carefully, and by listening to what was said in the pauses between sentences. He and Myrtle Fairchild began, without any formal declaration, to be the kind of people who sought each other's company. She would walk to Dawson's general store on Tuesday mornings, and he would happen to be there. And they would walk together back along Main Street, talking about the town and its hidden mechanics. And sometimes she would show him something she had found in Beaumont's accounts that troubled her, speaking with the careful precision of someone who was building a case rather than merely venting frustration. "He's not just overcharging on the mercantile goods," she told him one Tuesday morning in late June, stopping on the boardwalk to show him a page she had folded into her jacket pocket. "He's falsifying the land deed records. The Ortega family's property on the North Ridge, they've been paying on it for 3 years, and according to his books, the title still hasn't transferred. But the county land office shows the deed filed in Beaumont's name 6 months ago." Peter took the page and looked at it. He looked at her. "You're going to report this?" "I already sent a letter to the territorial auditor in Tucson," she said, with the calm of someone who had made a decision and was at peace with whatever came from it. "Myrtle," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and they both noticed it. "Beaumont is not a man who takes that kind of thing quietly." "No," she agreed. "He isn't." She took the page back from him and folded it carefully. "I know what I'm doing, Peter. I did not come all this way to keep my head down." He wanted to argue with her. He didn't, because she was right, and because there was something in the absolute steadiness of her conviction that he had no desire to push against. What he said instead was, "Then I'll be close." She looked at him for a long moment with those inventory-taking eyes. "Why?" He held her gaze. "Because you're worth being close to." The silence between them held the weight of something neither of them was quite ready to say out loud. And then she tucked the folded page into her jacket pocket and said, "Tuesday," as she turned and walked back toward the mercantile. And he stood on the boardwalk in the June sun and understood, with the specific clarity of a man who had spent a year learning what he actually needed, exactly how thoroughly he was in trouble. The trap Harold Beaumont set for Myrtle Fairchild was not immediate, because Beaumont was not an impulsive man. He was a patient man, which was far more dangerous. He received the notification from the territorial auditor's office in early July, a letter informing him that an inquiry had been opened based on a complaint from his employee, and he read it at his desk with the careful attention of a man reading a chess board, and then he set it aside and began constructing his countermove. It took him 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, he was cordial to Myrtle in the office, gave her a small raise without explanation, and smiled the particular recalibrated smile she had seen on her first day and had never stopped watching with suspicion. She told Peter about the raise on the Tuesday after it happened. "That's the most frightening thing you've told me yet," Peter said. "I know," she said. He had begun in those weeks to make inquiries of his own. He had ridden out to the Ortega family's land on the North Ridge and spoken with Elena Ortega, a woman of 40 with iron-gray hair and the weariness of someone who had been fighting an unfair battle for a long time, who told him that Beaumont had been threatening them with eviction since January, claiming they were squatting on land that legally belonged to him. He had visited the county land office in the neighboring town of Millhaven, where the records were kept by a nervous young deputy clerk who had received $200 in cash from a man matching Beaumont's description the previous autumn. He had found 3 other families, 2 Mexican, 1 newly arrived from Tennessee, who had similar stories, all of them afraid to speak publicly because Beaumont had made clear in the indirect language of powerful men that silence was the healthier choice. He brought all of this back to Myrtle. They sat across from each other at the small table in the back room of Dawson's general store that Cormac had made available to them with the conspiratorial delight of a man who enjoyed being adjacent to important events, and they laid out what they had between them like a map of difficult terrain. And Peter watched Myrtle Fairchild organize information with the same focused energy she brought to everything, and felt something in his chest that had been quietly growing for 2 months reach a point where he could no longer pretend it was anything other than what it was. "We need the ledger pages," she said. "The originals, not the copies he lets me see." Keeps them in the locked drawer of the second desk, the one he calls his personal records. I can get into that drawer, Peter said. She looked up at him. That's not legal. No, he agreed. It isn't. She held his gaze for a moment, and he could see her working through the ethics of it with the same meticulous honesty she applied to everything. Then she said, we document what we find, everything. Nothing gets used improperly. Agreed. And Peter. She waited until he met her eyes fully. Be careful, please. The please was quiet and unadorned, and it hit him somewhere beneath the ribs with considerable force. I'll be careful, he said. He broke into Harold Beaumont's private office on a Wednesday night in late July. While Beaumont was at the poker game, he attended every Wednesday at the Silver Horn Saloon without fail. He was inside for 14 minutes. He photographed nothing because there was no equipment for it. But he had a trained eye and a good memory, and he had also brought 12 sheets of blank paper and 2 graphite pencils, and he copied every relevant figure and entry from the locked ledger with the systematic speed of a man who had done similar work in the service of legitimate inquiry more times than he could count. When he came back out through the window he had entered by, he had 11 sheets covered in careful notation. He did not see the man standing in the alley shadow across the street. The man's name was Vic Harrow, and he worked for Harold Beaumont in a capacity that did not appear in any of the ledgers Myrtle had access to. The trap closed on Myrtle Fairchild on a Sunday morning in the first week of August, when Harold Beaumont's safe was found empty, and his private ledger was found open on his desk, and he walked directly to Sheriff Tate Coleman's office and reported a theft of $4,000 in cash and securities, and named his bookkeeper as the only person with sufficient knowledge of his affairs to have committed it. Peter was at his rooming house, 2 streets over, when he heard the commotion, and he came out onto the street to see Myrtle being escorted from the Mercantile by Sheriff Coleman himself, her hands not yet bound but the direction of travel unmistakable, and the look on her face was not fear. It was the specific, white-hot fury of a person who has predicted exactly this and is nonetheless furious to have been proven right. Their eyes met across the street. He took 1 step forward. She gave him the smallest, most controlled shake of her head, and he understood, not now, not like this. He understood also, with a cold drop in his stomach, that Beaumont had known about his visit to the private office, and that the trap had not been set for the previous Wednesday but had been waiting, preloaded, for the moment Myrtle made herself too dangerous to tolerate through legitimate obstruction. He did not go to the sheriff's office immediately. He went to Dawson's General Store and sat in the back room with his 11 sheets of careful notes and thought for a long time about the shape of what he was dealing with. Beaumont had reported a theft. The money would not be found in Myrtle's possession because there was no money to find, but absence of evidence was not the same as evidence of absence in a county where the judge and the leading men of the town had extensive financial relationships with Harold Beaumont. The territorial auditor's inquiry would take months, possibly longer. Myrtle could be convicted and sentenced before it ever resolved. He needed more than careful notes. He needed witnesses. Sheriff Tate Coleman was, Peter had determined over the previous weeks, not a corrupt man but an intimidated one, which was a different problem and one slightly more susceptible to solution. He was a man in his mid-50s who had taken the job because it came with a salary and a house, and had discovered too late that it also came with Harold Beaumont, who had been the swing vote on the town council that hired him, and had never let him forget it. Coleman had the guilty look of a man perpetually aware of the compromises he had made and equally perpetually unable to see a way out of them. Peter visited him the afternoon of Myrtle's arrest and laid 7 of his 11 sheets of notes on the desk in front of him. He did not tell Coleman where he had gotten the information. He said only that it was verifiable through public record with sufficient investigative effort, and that a woman was in a cell down the hall being charged with a crime engineered by the same man whose financial crimes he had there on his desk in black graphite. Coleman looked at the sheets for a long time. He looked at Peter. Even if all of this is true, he said, Beaumont has the judge. He has the prosecutor. He has 6 men on the jury pool who are in debt to him directly." "I know," Peter said. "That's why I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm asking you to let me have time." "Time for what?" "To find what I need to prove this." Coleman was quiet. He was quiet for long enough that Peter thought the answer was going to be no. Then Coleman said, "I will make certain she is treated fairly in that cell, and I will not rush the schedule of the trial any faster than the law requires. That is what I can do." "That's enough," Peter said. "For now." He visited Myrtle in her cell that same evening. The cell was small and clean, which was the best that could be said for it, and she was sitting on the narrow cot with her father's copy of David Copperfield open in her lap, because Coleman, in a small act of decency, had allowed her to have books. She looked up when Peter appeared at the bars, and the relief that crossed her face was immediately followed by a careful composure that he recognized as the face she put on when she needed to be strong in front of someone she cared about. "He planted it well," she said quietly. "He's been planning it since your letter to the auditor," Peter confirmed. He kept his voice low. "The safe story is false. He emptied it himself. There's a man named Vic Harrow who works for him. I've been asking around, and Harrow was seen near the back of the Mercantile the night before the supposed theft was reported. Can Harrow be found?" "I'm going to find him," Peter said. "Myrtle." He put his hand through the bars, and she looked at it and then took it, and her grip was firm and warm, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was too much to say and not enough space for it in a jailhouse corridor. "I need you to hold on. The trial isn't scheduled for another 3 months. 3 months, she said. "I know." He looked at her hand in his. "I'm going to get you out of this." She studied his face with that direct, inventory-taking gaze, and he realized she was checking not for reassurance but for truth, because she was someone who preferred an honest difficulty to a comfortable lie. Whatever she found in his expression satisfied her, because she nodded once and said, "Then I will hold on. And Peter, the Ortega family. If Beaumont moves against them while I'm in here, I'll make sure they're warned," he said. "I promise." He visited Elena Ortega the next morning and told her what was happening and what Beaumont was likely to do next. And Elena Ortega, who had been fighting for her family's land for 3 years, listened with the focused attention of a general reviewing a map, and then said that she had a brother in Millhaven who was a lawyer, and that she would send for him immediately. The lawyer's name was Francisco Ortega, and he arrived 4 days later on the noon stage, and he was exactly what he sounded like: a small, precise man with impeccable manners and the specific tenacity of someone who had grown up watching powerful men steal from his family and had decided to become the thing that stopped them. Peter met him at the stage and liked him immediately. They worked together for the next 6 weeks. Francisco took on Myrtle's defense formally, filing the necessary papers with the court, and he and Peter divided the labor between them, Francisco building the legal structure of her defense from the public records and the accounts Myrtle herself had documented during her employment, Peter doing the other work, the kind that happened on horseback and in places the law didn't quite reach. He found Vic Harrow in a mining camp 30 miles south of Redemption Creek, living under a different name, which told Peter everything he needed to know about the man's guilt and the level of his employer's planning. He did not confront Harrow directly. He watched the camp for 2 days and learned Harrow's pattern and who he talked to and what he drank and how he held himself when he thought no one was paying attention. And when he had enough, he rode back to Redemption Creek and reported to Francisco. Francisco was the one who made the formal approach to Harrow, under the legal protection of a deposition request, which made it considerably harder for Beaumont to simply make the man disappear. They met Harrow in the mining camp with Coleman present as a witness, and Francisco laid out, with precise and methodical calm, exactly what they knew and exactly what the alternative to cooperation looked like for Harrow specifically. Harrow was not a particularly brave man, and the specific cowardice that had made him useful to Beaumont was now a liability that Francisco leveraged with clinical efficiency. He agreed to provide a statement. The statement described, in uncomfortable detail, how Harold Beaumont had directed Harrow to empty the safe on the night of August 7th and remove the contents to a location that Harrow named specifically, a locked box under the floorboards of the small outbuilding behind the house of a man named Dennis Croft, who was Beaumont's cousin and closest associate. Coleman went to Dennis Croft's property with a warrant the following Tuesday. The box was there. The money was there. The securities were there. He brought them back to Redemption Creek, and Peter rode directly to the jail and told Myrtle, and she set David Copperfield aside and pressed both hands flat against her knees and took 3 measured breaths. "He'll change his story," she said. "He already has," Peter confirmed. "Beaumont is saying you and I conspired together to steal from him, and that Harrow is a Confederate we bribed to give false testimony." She looked at him. "What does Francisco say?" "Francisco says we need one more thing," Peter said. "The original ledger pages. The ones that prove the land fraud. We have copies, but Beaumont will claim they're fabricated. He keeps the originals in a locked box in the floorboards under his own desk," Myrtle said quietly. "I saw him open it once when he thought I wasn't looking. I said nothing because at the time I thought I could document everything I needed from the accessible records, but if you need what's in that box, I need to know exactly where," he said. She described it with precise, careful detail. The specific position of the loose board, the type of lock, the approximate dimensions of the box. He listened to every word. "Myrtle," he said when she had finished, "when this is over." "When this is over," she said softly and stopped, and the unfinished sentence sat between them with all its implied meaning, and her eyes held his for a moment that felt entirely outside the boundaries of a jailhouse corridor. Then she said, "When this is over, I would like to sit somewhere that is not made of iron bars and have a proper conversation and have a cup of coffee that does not taste like a tin can." "I'll arrange it," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "I'll get you the finest cup of coffee in Redemption Creek." "That bar," she said, with a faint smile that was the most beautiful thing he had seen in weeks, "is extremely low." He broke into Beaumont's office for the second time on a Thursday night in mid-September, and this time he was faster and he was watching for Vic Harrow's replacement, and he found the loose board and the locked box exactly where Myrtle had described it, and he picked the lock with the slim tool he kept in his boot, and inside were the original ledger pages and 4 signed documents that were, as Francisco later described them with considerable professional satisfaction, a complete confession of fraud rendered in Harold Beaumont's own hand. He rode to Tucson 2 days later, carrying the original documents in the leather satchel that would later sit on the courtroom railing like a gavel strike. He went to the territorial auditor's office first, and then to the circuit court judge's clerk, and then to a notary, and then to a telegraph office where he sent Francisco a message that consisted of 6 words: "Coming back. Have everything we need." The trial had been scheduled for the 2nd week of October, and he rode back to Redemption Creek in 4 days of hard riding that turned his face to leather and his back to a column of constant low protest. And he arrived on the morning of October 11th, which was the 3rd day of the trial. And he pulled his horse to the hitching post outside the courthouse and took the leather satchel and went up the wooden steps and put both hands on the courthouse doors and pushed them open with the full force of a man who had ridden 200 miles on behalf of truth and was not inclined to be subtle about his arrival. Now standing 3 feet from the judge's bench with the leather satchel on the railing and every eye in the room on him, Peter Rourke waited while Judge Ambrose Whitfield, a heavy-set man with a gray beard, and the cautious eyes of someone who was beginning to understand he was being asked to choose a side, looked at him over his spectacles. "Mr. Rourke," the judge said, "this is highly irregular." "Yes, Your Honor," Peter agreed. "It is. But so is the prosecution's case, which is built on a theft that did not happen, a witness who was bribed with $200, and a hidden motive that Mr. Beaumont has been hoping no one would look at too carefully." He opened the leather satchel and laid the contents on the railing with the systematic care of a man who had organized them precisely for this moment. I have here the original ledger pages from Harold Beaumont's private records, authenticated by the Territorial Auditor's Office in Tucson. I have 4 signed documents in Beaumont's own hand, authorizing the fraudulent transfer of deeds belonging to the Ortega family, the Garza family, the Reyes family, and the Callaway family, all 4 of which occurred without the knowledge or consent of the legal owners. I have a signed statement from Victor Harrow, witnessed by Sheriff Tate Coleman, describing how he was directed by Harold Beaumont to remove the contents of Beaumont's own safe and conceal them at the property of Dennis Croft. And I have a letter from the Territorial Auditor confirming that an investigation into Beaumont's land office activities has been formally opened, and that Miss Myrtle Fairchild is named therein not as a suspect, but as the original complainant. The courtroom had gone so still that the sound of someone shifting in the gallery was as loud as a shout. Gerald Ashcroft was standing now, his face a particular shade of red that suggested an argument was building behind it, but Francisco Ortega was already on his feet at the defense table, and he spoke first. "Your Honor," Francisco said, "I move that all charges against Myrtle Fairchild be dismissed on the grounds that the prosecution's case rests entirely on fabricated evidence produced by the true criminal party in this matter, and that the documents and testimony presented by Mr. Rourke establish not only her innocence but the specific mechanism by which she was framed." Ashcroft started in. "Your Honor, this man is an outlaw. His methods are—" "His methods," Judge Whitfield said, holding up one large hand, "are secondary to the substance of what he's presented, Mr. Ashcroft." He was looking at the documents now, turning them in his hands with the careful attention of a man who understood he was looking at something that changed everything. He looked up at Peter over his spectacles. "These are authenticated by the Territorial Auditor's Office, Your Honor. There is a certification stamp on each page." The judge put the documents down and looked at the courtroom for a long moment, and then he looked at Myrtle Fairchild at the defense table, who had her bound hands folded in front of her on the scarred wood, and was looking at him with the patient directness of someone who had been waiting for justice with more composure than most men could have managed, and something in the judge's face shifted into a decision. "The charges against Myrtle Fairchild are dismissed," he said. "Mr. Ashcroft, I'd advise you to consult with your client about the nature of his current legal exposure before you say another word in this courtroom." The explosion of noise from the gallery was immediate. Ashcroft sat down heavily. Harold Beaumont, who had been seated in the front row of the gallery as the reporting victim, stood up with the particular dangerous stillness of a man whose plan had just collapsed, and Sheriff Coleman, who had positioned himself near the side door with the prudence of a man who had received Peter's coded message the previous day, put a hand on Beaumont's arm with gentle but unmistakable authority. And Myrtle Fairchild rose from her chair at the defense table, her hands still bound, and looked at Peter Rourke across the courtroom, and the expression on her face was not triumph, though she had earned that. It was not relief, though she must have felt it like a flood. What it was, specifically, was the way a person looks at the exact face they had been holding in their mind through the longest weeks of their life, and the seeing of it after the holding of it is almost more than the heart can carry without making itself known. Francisco was at her side with the rope bindings in a moment, working the knot free with careful fingers, and when they fell away, she rubbed her wrists and walked toward the aisle, and Peter walked toward the defense table, and they met in the middle of the courtroom, in the noise and the movement of the gallery erupting around them. And he was about to say something careful and measured, because that was what the moment seemed to call for. And instead she stepped forward and put both arms around him with the entirety of her strength, pressing her face against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her and held her in the way of a man who had been afraid, specifically and personally, and for weeks of losing this exact person, and is now holding the physical proof that he is not. "You came back," she said into his chest. He could feel the words more than hear them. I said I would, he said against her hair. I will always come back. Outside the courthouse, in the dust and bright October sun, the town of Redemption Creek was reorganizing itself around a new truth. Harold Beaumont was escorted to the sheriff's office by Coleman and 2 deputies, and the crowd outside the courthouse steps was a mixture of the relieved, the vindicated, and the quietly satisfied. Elena Ortega stood at the edge of the crowd with her brother Francisco, and when Myrtle came down the steps, Elena stepped forward and took her hands and said something in a low voice that made Myrtle close her eyes briefly and nod. Peter stood at the bottom of the steps and watched the town around him, and felt the specific kind of tiredness that comes not from defeat, but from the completion of something that had required everything you had. Cormac Dawson appeared at his elbow with the cheerful inevitability of a man who arrives exactly when he is most welcome. I believe, Cormac said, that I mentioned this town had the feel of a place about to crack open. You did, Peter confirmed. And were you right to stay? Peter looked at Myrtle, who was talking to Elena Ortega with the restored energy of a woman whose chains had just been removed in every sense of the word, and the October sun was on her hair and her face, and she was herself again, fully and completely herself, and it was the best thing he had seen in his life. Yes, he said, I was right to stay. Harold Beaumont was formally charged by the territorial authorities 6 weeks later with land fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The trial, conducted in Millhaven by a circuit judge who had no financial relationship with the defendant, lasted 8 days and resulted in a conviction on all counts. He was sentenced to 12 years in the territorial prison at Yuma, and the fraudulent land deeds were vacated by the court. And the Ortega family, the Garza family, the Reyes family, and the Calloway family had their titles restored with the kind of formal legal ceremony that, however small, carried the weight of something long overdue. Dennis Croft, who had harbored the stolen money, received a lighter sentence in exchange for cooperation, and was required to repay the full amount from the sale of his property. Vic Harrow served 8 months in the county jail and left the territory afterward, and was not heard from in Redemption Creek again. Gerald Ashcroft, having represented a convicted fraudster with a case built on manufactured evidence, found that his legal practice in the territory underwent a significant contraction in the months that followed, which was widely considered appropriate. In all of this aftermath, there was a great deal of formal business and paperwork and legal resolution, and through it all, Myrtle Fairchild navigated with the same methodical competence she had brought to every other challenge in her life, and Peter Rourke was never far. He had taken up more permanent accommodations in Redemption Creek. He had not exactly decided to do this in any formal sense. It had simply become apparent, over the weeks after the trial, that leaving was not a thing he was going to do, and at a certain point continuing to pay for a room at Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house by the week became an acknowledgment of a permanence that he might as well formalize. He told Mrs. Hennessy he would take the room monthly. Mrs. Hennessy looked at him with the knowing expression of a woman who had seen a great deal of life and said, "About time," without further explanation. He and Myrtle had, as she had requested, proper conversations with proper coffee. Cormac Dawson had acquired, through some supply chain miracle of which he was very proud, actual good coffee from New Orleans by way of Tucson, and he made it available to them in the back room of his store on Tuesday mornings, with the proud air of a man providing the right backdrop for something important. They talked about the Ortegas and the land restoration. They talked about the territorial auditor's ongoing investigation, which was finding things that made Myrtle both vindicated and horrified in equal measure. They talked about her father and the books, and one Tuesday morning she brought the copy of David Copperfield she had read in her cell and set it on the table between them. "I read it 4 times, she said. "It got me through." He picked it up and turned it in his hands, It was a worn copy, the spine cracked from many readings, with small pencil annotations in the margins in her handwriting. "What do you annotate?" he asked. "Things that strike me as true," she said. "Things that are stated precisely." He opened to a random page and found 3 pencil annotations in her small, precise hand. One of them, next to a passage he recognized from early in the book, said simply, "This is what it feels like to discover a person." He looked up from the page and found her watching him with the very particular expression of someone who knows you have found the thing they were not sure they wanted you to find. "Myrtle," he said. "Yes," she said quietly, as if answering a question he had not yet asked out loud but which they had both been circling for months. The single word carried everything. The acknowledgement, the returning of it, the agreement that whatever this was, they had both arrived at it by the same road. He set the book down on the table. He reached across and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand palm up and laced her fingers through his with the confident directness of a woman who had decided something and was not going to perform uncertainty she did not feel. "I would like," he said carefully, "to be very clear about something." "Please be," she said. "I rode 200 miles in 4 days," he said. "Not because it was the right thing to do, not because I had professional interest in the outcome. Because you were in that cell and I was not going to let it stand. Because you are—" He stopped. The word he needed was large enough that getting it out felt like lifting something heavy. "Because you are the most honest, clearest thinking, boldest person I have ever met. And I have been in love with you since June, and I apologize for waiting until November to say it plainly. But I wanted to say it somewhere other than a jailhouse corridor." Myrtle Fairchild was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, which he experienced as approximately 3 years, and then she said, "I fell in love with you on the corner of Main Street and Copper Lane when you stepped the same direction I did and then had the audacity to hand me my own envelopes." He blinked. "That was the first day we met." "Yes," she said, with the faintest suggestion of a smile. "You hid it very well." "I hide things I'm not yet sure of," she said. "I was sure by the church social, but I thought I should wait until you were." He looked at her across the table, this woman who had walked into a strange town with a carpet bag and a letter, and discovered a fraud and reported it and sat in a jail cell reading Dickens for 3 months while the walls closed in, and had done all of it with a clarity and a courage that still stopped him cold when he thought about it directly. "I'm sure," he said. "Good," she said. "So am I." He came around the table and she stood, and he kissed her in the back room of Dawson's General Store among the coffee smell and the stacked supplies. And it was the kind of kiss that had 3 months of worry and longing folded into it, and came out the other side as something warmer and quieter and entirely different from anything in his previous experience. And when they finally separated, she kept her hands in his lapels for a moment and looked at him and said, "You could have told me on Main Street." "I could have," he admitted. "We lost 6 months. We had the church social," he said, "and the Tuesday mornings. That," she said, "is not an adequate substitute for honesty." "Noted," he said. "I intend to be very honest going forward." She smiled, and this time it was the full smile, the unreserved one that had started somewhere real, and he thought that whatever else happened in his life from this point forward, every good and difficult thing, this would be the measuring point. Cormac Dawson, who had absolutely been hovering near the doorway, cleared his throat from a decorous distance. "More coffee?" he called in. "Yes," Peter called back. 2 cups. And Cormac, "Thank you." "Don't mention it," Cormac said happily, and could be heard whistling to himself as he went to the stove. The weeks that followed had the quality of something long wound tight beginning to ease. Myrtle had found new employment quickly. Francisco Ortega had, in the process of their work together, recognized her abilities with considerable clarity, and had offered her a position as his bookkeeper and legal assistant, which came with legitimate accounts and a formal salary and a workplace that was conspicuously free of fraudulent safes. She accepted without hesitation, and moved her carpet bag and her father's books to a proper room in a proper boarding house on the decent side of Redemption Creek, and began her new employment with the same systematic competence she brought to everything. Peter, for the first time in years, found himself thinking about what shape permanence might take in his life. He had been in motion since he was 17, first working for Samuel Cord and then alone, and the restlessness had always felt like necessity rather than choice, but standing still in Redemption Creek felt like neither restlessness nor captivity. It felt like arrival. He had some money saved from the years with Cord, and he had a reputation in the territory as someone who found things and solved problems with integrity. And Cormac Dawson, who was expanding his business and needed someone with connections and knowledge of the territory's supply routes, made him a proposal one Thursday morning that he took away and thought about for 2 days and then accepted. A partnership arrangement in the supply operation, which would give him work that used his knowledge of the territory without requiring him to be perpetually in the saddle. He told Myrtle about it on a Tuesday in Cormac's back room, and she listened and then asked 4 very precise questions about the financial structure of the arrangement, all of which he could answer, and then she said, "That sounds like something that could support a settled life." "That was the thought," he said. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "A settled life would require a settled situation," she said, "in terms of living arrangements." "It would," he said. "Which would require," she said, with the careful precision of a woman who is saying something important through the medium of careful precision, "some formalization." He set his coffee cup down. He looked at her with the full, direct attention she had always brought to him and that he now brought entirely back to her. "Myrtle Fairchild," he said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to know that I mean it with every honest part of me, which after everything you have seen of me in the past several months you have the evidence to evaluate fairly." "I do," she said steadily. "Will you marry me?" She was quiet. Not the frightening 3-second quiet of November, but a breathing, considering quiet, the kind that came before a decision that was already made and just needed the space of one breath to say out loud. "Yes," she said. "With the condition that we stop calling it formalization and call it what it actually is." "What is it?" he asked. "The thing we have been building since the corner of Main Street and Copper Lane," she said. "The most important thing either of us has ever done." He reached across the table and she reached back and their hands met in the middle. And Cormac Dawson, from his post at the stove, heard the quality of the silence and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood looking at the wall with a very satisfied expression. They were married in January of 1884 in the small white church on the edge of Redemption Creek, in a ceremony that was conducted by the Methodist minister and attended by everyone in town who had any reason to wish them well, which was most of it. Elena Ortega brought tamales wrapped in cloth, and Francisco stood as a witness beside Cormac Dawson, who was the other witness and who cried freely and without apology throughout the proceedings. Myrtle wore a dress of deep blue that she had ordered from a dressmaker in Tucson, a practical woman's choice that also happened to be beautiful, and her hair was done in the style she preferred simply, without the elaborate architecture of fashionable ceremony. And she walked down the aisle of the church with the same steady, purposeful gait she brought to everything. And when she reached Peter at the front and looked up at him, he saw in her face the entire sum of who she was. The courage and the honesty and the humor and the love, all of it, all at once looking at him. He had written his vows himself, because he was not a man comfortable with borrowed words, and when it was his turn he said them plainly. That he would be honest with her in all things, that he would not let distance or difficulty stop him from returning to wherever she was, that he would spend his life being worthy of the trust she had extended to him not out of naivety but out of clear-eyed judgment, and that if she ever found discrepancy in his accounts she should report it to him directly. The last part made her laugh, fully and without covering her mouth, in the middle of the church, and the congregation laughed with her, and the minister beamed, and Peter took both her hands in his and felt the particular wholeness of a man who has found the missing coordinates of himself. They moved into a house on the western side of Redemption Creek, a proper house with 2 rooms and a kitchen, and a porch that looked out toward the mountains, which Peter had purchased in December, and Myrtle had made into a home in the space of a week with the same organized efficiency she applied to everything. She brought her father's books and shelved them along the wall of the main room, and Peter added to them over time from every town he passed through on supply runs, and the shelf grew into something that was both a library and a record of the years. He would bring her books, and she would have them read by the time he came home. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, in the particular Arizona light that turned everything gold and then rose and then dark, and they would talk about the books and the town and the supply business and the ongoing resolutions of the Beaumont aftermath, which continued to produce revelations at regular intervals for the better part of a year. Peter had long evenings of story from the road. Myrtle had the careful intelligence of someone who saw the patterns in things and could describe them with surgical precision, and he had never in his life had anyone to come home to who could do that, and it was the discovery of a specific happiness he had not known to want. In the spring of 1884, Myrtle told him one morning over breakfast that she was expecting a child. She told him in the direct, unflinching way she told him everything, sitting across the table from him with her coffee cup, watching his face. He set down his fork and looked at her for a moment and then said, "Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair so they were eye level, and took her hand, and she looked at him with the expression that he had learned was what love looked like on her face when she wasn't being careful about showing it. "I'm going to be here," he said, "every day of it." "I know," she said. She squeezed his hand. "I know you will." Their son was born in October of 1884, which was exactly 1 year after the trial that had changed everything. They named him Thomas, after Myrtle's father. He was a healthy, loud, considerably opinionated infant who arrived in the world with a full set of opinions about his own comfort and the schedule of his parents, and who, from the very first week, demonstrated the kind of focused determination that suggested he had inherited something specific from both of them. Peter Rourke, who had spent 15 years of his life in a state of productive restlessness, discovered that holding his son on the porch in the evening while the Arizona sky ran through its colors was a form of stillness that contained more than he had ever found in motion. He did not miss the road in the way he had expected to. He missed particular things about it, the problem-solving, the particular freedom of knowing only the next horizon. But the life he had in Redemption Creek was larger than those things, not smaller. The supply business with Cormac grew steadily through 1884 and into 1885, expanding into a route that covered 6 towns and employed 3 men besides Peter and Cormac. And Myrtle, from her position with Francisco Ortega's office, began quietly advising on the accounts and contracts with the kind of contributions that were formally uncredited, but universally understood to be essential. Francisco had taken on 3 additional cases by then, representing families in land disputes that the Beaumont investigation had surfaced, and Myrtle's work with the documentation had shaped the legal strategy on 2 of them. The Ortegas threw a celebration when they received the final documentation of their restored title in March of 1885, a gathering at their house on the North Ridge that lasted from noon until well after dark, with food and music and a bonfire that could be seen from the main street of Redemption Creek, and Myrtle and Peter were guests of honor in the warmest sense of that term. Elena Ortega embraced Myrtle at the door and said, "My family has its land because of you," and Myrtle said, "Your family's land was always yours," and they both understood the weight of what was exchanged. Peter stood with Francisco near the bonfire later in the evening while Thomas, 8 months old and extremely alert, was passed between a succession of delighted Ortega aunts, and Francisco said, "You rode 200 miles for her." 212, Peter said. "I counted on the way back." Francisco laughed, the easy laugh of a man who had spent the past year watching justice work and finding it satisfying. "She is remarkable, your wife." "Yes," Peter said simply. The word was too small for what he meant, but it was also exactly the right size for the way he meant it, without embellishment, without performance, as a statement of fact that he would go to his grave believing. Thomas learned to walk in the spring of 1885, with the same single-minded determination he had brought to every developmental milestone, and promptly applied his new mobility to an investigation of every corner of the house and yard that his parents had previously considered safe, which required a comprehensive reassessment of the concept of safety. Myrtle tracked his explorations with the fond attention of a woman who recognized a familiar quality and was enjoying watching it take shape in a new person. She told Peter in the summer of 1885 that they were expecting a second child, with the same directness and the same over-breakfast timing as the first announcement, and he responded with the same crouching beside her chair and the same taking of her hand, and she told him he didn't need to make a whole ceremony of it every time, and he told her that yes, actually, he did, and she laughed the full, unreserved laugh, and Thomas, who was by then walking and watching everything with enormous dark eyes, looked at them from across the room with the expression of a person who is deciding whether the situation requires his personal involvement. Their second child, a daughter, was born in February of 1886 on a cold morning when the desert had frost on the ground, and the mountains were white against a sky, the particular shade of gray-blue that precedes clear. They named her Frances, and she arrived in the world with a quietness that was not the absence of personality, but rather a different expression of it. She watched and observed from the very beginning with a seriousness that made Myrtle say, one evening while feeding her on the porch, that she was fairly certain Frances had her grandfather's eyes. Peter sat beside them on the porch in the February cold, Thomas asleep inside, and looked at his wife and his daughter in the fading light and thought, as he did with some regularity now, about the corner of Main Street and Copper Lane and the ledger pages and the 4 days on horseback, and the courtroom, and how the accumulated weight of all of it had delivered him here to this porch, to this specific and irreplaceable life. "You're looking at me again," Myrtle said, without looking up from Frances. "I am," he said. "Any particular reason?" "The usual one," he said. She looked up then, and her expression was the one she had stopped being careful about years ago, the full, clear, unguarded one. "The usual one is still enough," she said, "after this long." "It's more than it was," he said, "every year." She shifted Frances slightly and held out her free hand to him, and he took it and held it, and the Arizona evening settled around them, and the mountains held their silence, and inside the house, Thomas slept the heavy, certain sleep of a child who knows that his world is whole. The years built on themselves the way years do when they are good ones, each one deepened by the ones before. Cormac Dawson expanded the store in 1886, and Peter's supply route became the backbone of commerce for a cluster of small towns that were growing with the continued prosperity of the territory. Francisco Ortega won 3 of his land cases in territorial court in 1886 and 1887, establishing precedents that protected other families from the kind of fraud that had trapped the Ortegas, and his practice grew into something that required a proper office and 2 clerks, one of whom was Myrtle, who had reorganized his filing system in 1885 and never really left. Thomas started school in the fall of 1887 and was immediately reported by his teacher, Miss Augusta Pringle, to be the most argumentative student in the class, which Myrtle received as information with a perfectly neutral expression and privately considered entirely predictable. He was also, Miss Pringle noted, the most thorough in his reasoning, which Myrtle considered equally predictable and considerably more satisfying. Frances at age 2 was a person who had the patience of someone much older and the observational capacity of someone already compiling evidence, and she followed her mother around the house with a focused attention that Myrtle described to Peter as being studied, which she meant as both a description and a form of pride. In the autumn of 1887, they received news from the territorial prison at Yuma that Harold Beaumont had died of a fever in July, having served 4 years of his 12-year sentence. Peter told Myrtle the news, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "I hope he had time to reckon with what he took from people." And that was the full extent of what either of them said about Harold Beaumont, who had been the instrument of the worst months of their lives and the unlikely proximate cause of everything good that had come from them. They planted a kitchen garden in the spring of 1888 that Myrtle managed with the focused pleasure of a person, discovering that patience applied to living things has a different and particular reward. Peter built a second bookshelf for the main room when the first one ran out of space, and Myrtle organized both of them with a system she described as intuitive, and Peter experienced as impossible to decode without a guide, which she provided upon request with the patient pleasure of a teacher. Their third child, another boy, came in the summer of 1888, and they named him James after Peter's father, who had been a man of considerable steadiness in a life that had asked for it frequently. James arrived with his brother's decisive energy and his sister's watchful eyes, which seemed at first like a paradox and quickly became apparent as a personality. A child who observed carefully and then acted with total commitment, which Peter found both familiar and slightly daunting. Myrtle recovered from James's birth with her characteristic efficiency and was back at Francisco's office within 3 weeks, James in a basket beside her desk, where he slept with the philosophical calm of an infant who has determined that the world will accommodate his needs and is willing to wait for proof of this. The clerks in Francisco's office learned to work around the basket with the natural adaptation of people who accept that work and life are not separate territories with a clean border between them. Peter brought Myrtle wildflowers from the desert on the mornings when he came back from supply runs, which were not grand gestures so much as the accumulation of small certain ones, the kind that add up over years into something that needs no single dramatic moment to prove itself. She pressed the dried ones into the back pages of the books on the shelf, and when Thomas was older and found them there and asked what they were, she said they were proof that some things lasted, and that he should always pay attention to the small things because the large things were made of them. In the spring of 1889, Sheriff Tate Coleman retired after 30 years of law work and nominated Peter Rourke for the position of town sheriff to the town council, to considerable surprise from several of the council members who were aware of Peter's history, and considerable amusement from Cormac Dawson, who was on the council and voted yes, with the enthusiasm of a man who has waited a long time to do a specific thing. Peter accepted on the condition that he could restructure the supply partnership with Cormac to accommodate the change, which Cormac agreed to immediately, and took up the sheriff's office in May of 1889 with a directness and fairness that, within 6 months, had produced a reputation for the kind of justice that did not require the application of power to people who already had none. He was good at it. He had always been good at finding things and solving problems, and the work of keeping the peace in a growing town turned out to require the same precise attention to what was actually there versus what people were claiming was there, the same willingness to follow evidence into uncomfortable places that he had been doing most of his working life. The difference was that he came home in the evenings to the house on the western side of town, and the porch, and the mountains, and the accumulated family that waited there made every difficult day navigable in a way that years of solitary work had not. Myrtle came to his office one afternoon in the fall of 1889 with a ledger under her arm, her own personal ledger, she explained, in which she had been keeping careful notes on a pattern she had noticed in the transactions of a new land speculator who had arrived in Redemption Creek in the summer, and was doing something with the mining company accounts that did not smell clean. He looked at her ledger. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the specific expression she had worn on the corner of Main Street and Copper Lane when she had been carrying her envelopes and her secrets and her contained fury about what she had found. "Not again," he said. "Different man," she said. "Similar shape of problem. Myrtle, I know," she said. "I know, but I cannot see a wrong thing and leave it alone. You know that about me." "I do know that about you," he said. He looked at the ledger again. "Is it solid?" "Very," she said. He took the ledger. He spent the next 2 weeks working through what she had found with the methodical patience he had learned from watching her work. And at the end of 2 weeks, he had enough to bring a formal inquiry to the territorial auditor's office and to the new circuit judge who was, unlike the judge at Myrtle's trial, a man of full and unimpeachable integrity. The land speculator, a man named Alderton, was investigated and charged and convicted within 8 months, and 4 families whose claims he had been manipulating received proper title to their land. The territory took notice. The circuit court judge wrote to the territorial governor commending the work of both the Redemption Creek sheriff and the independent investigator who had compiled the initial evidence. And the governor's office sent a letter of appreciation that Peter read aloud to Myrtle over breakfast while she fed James, and managed not to look particularly impressed, because she never particularly looked impressed by formal recognition, only by actual results. "You should be proud," he said. "I am," she said. "I'm just more interested in whether the Domings family got their title properly filed." "They did," he said. "I checked yesterday." "Then I'm satisfied," she said, and went back to James. And Peter watched her and thought, not for the first time, that whatever the word was for the feeling of being exactly where you were supposed to be in life, doing exactly the thing your nature required in exactly the company that made you most fully yourself. He had been living inside it for 6 years now, and still had not found a word large enough for it. Thomas, in the fall of 1890, was 7 years old and in the 2nd grade, and had begun to read his grandmother's books from the shelf, with the focused determination of a child who has discovered a door into a larger world and intends to walk through every room. He asked his mother every evening what the word was for whatever new thing he had encountered that day, and she always knew, and when she didn't know for certain she would say so, and they would look it up together, because she had never seen the point of pretending to knowledge she didn't have, which was a lesson Thomas was learning not from instruction but from daily example. Francis, at 4, had developed a particular friendship with Elena Ortega's youngest granddaughter, a girl named Rosa, and they spent Saturday afternoons at each other's houses with the easy naturalness of children whose families had been woven together by shared history into something that felt permanent. Elena Ortega had, at some point in the years since the trial, become the person Myrtle visited when she needed the particular comfort of talking to someone who had navigated serious injustice and come out the other side with her spirit intact. They drank tea on Elena's porch and talked about the town and the families and the land and the way things were changing in the territory, and the friendship had become one of the anchors of Myrtle's life. James, at 2, was the most mobile of the 3 children and the most cheerful about it, treating the house and yard as a personal adventure territory, and returning from each expedition with the triumphant air of an explorer who has discovered something worth reporting. Peter had developed the habit of carrying him on one arm during morning rounds of the town, which James found entirely correct and proper, and which had made the youngest Rourke a familiar and welcome presence on the main street of Redemption Creek from the time he could hold his head up. In the winter of 1890, Myrtle told Peter over breakfast, same table, same coffee cups, same directness, that she thought their family of 5 was complete. She said it with the thoughtful certainty of someone who had considered it carefully and arrived at a conclusion she was at peace with, and she looked at him across the table and waited. He thought about Thomas with his books and Francis with her careful watching and James with his cheerful territorial expeditions and the house that was full in a way he had not known to want until he had it, and he nodded. "I think so too," he said, "unless you change your mind." "I might change my mind," she said. "I reserve the right." "Of course," he said, "but not today." "Not today," he agreed. She stood and came around the table and bent and kissed him on the top of his head, which was a thing she did with the casual warmth of someone who has stopped tracking the accumulated weight of small affections and simply lives inside them. And then she said she was late for the office and picked up her coat and her bag and her ledger and went out into the morning. And he heard her footsteps on the porch and then the gate, and then silence. He sat for a moment with his coffee, which was the good New Orleans coffee that Cormac still supplied with the proprietary pride of a man who considers this his contribution to a love story he had been adjacent to since the beginning. And he listened to Thomas getting out of bed upstairs with the thumping footsteps of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned the concept of gradual, and Frances's quiet voice saying something to her brother, and James's joyful commentary from his room about the state of the morning, and the general noise of a life that was full and permanent and entirely his. And he thought about a Thursday morning in April of 1883, when he had had no particular reason to stop in Redemption Creek and had stopped anyway. He had been asked more than once over the years how a man who had lived the way he had lived on the road, on the edge of the law, between places and never in them, had come to this. A sheriff's badge, a house with a porch, 3 children, and a wife who could see through any lie told in any ledger ever constructed. His answer was always the same, and it was always the truth. He had looked at Myrtle Fairchild on the corner of Main Street and Copper Lane, and he had known, in the way that is not dramatic but is entirely irrefutable, that whatever came next was going to matter in a way that nothing before it had. And then she had walked into his life with her honesty and her courage and her refusal to look away from what was wrong. And he had walked into a courthouse 4 months later with everything he needed to prove that every lie told about her was a lie. And somewhere in the full arc of all of it, the jailhouse corridors, and the Tuesday mornings, and the back room of Dawson's General Store, and the vows, and the porch, and the children, and the years, he had found the thing that his 15 years of motion had been the long way around to reaching. Home, not a place, not a town, a person, and the life that grew up around her, and the specific, irreducible fact of her hand in his. On an evening in the early spring of 1891, Peter Rourke sat on the porch of the house on the western edge of Redemption Creek and watched the Arizona sun take the sky apart in rose and gold. Myrtle sat beside him with her cup of coffee, and Thomas was inside reading, and Frances was asleep already, and James was at the stage of being put to bed that involved a great deal of negotiation, the last of which could be heard through the open window as a descending series of gradually less convincing arguments. Eventually the arguments ceased and gave way to the deep silence of a child who has surrendered to sleep mid-sentence. Myrtle smiled into her coffee cup. Peter watched her smile. "Happy," he said. She considered it with her usual honest care because she did not give automatic answers to questions that deserved real ones. The mountains were purple in the last light. The town behind them made the small sounds of evening. Inside, the books lined the walls and the children slept, and Cormac Dawson's good coffee was warm in her cup. "Yes," she said, "completely." She turned and looked at him, and her eyes held the same clear, direct attention that had taken him apart on the corner of Main Street and Copper Lane on a Thursday morning 8 years ago, and had been doing it ever since, every single day, with no loss of effect. "Are you?" He reached over and took her hand, and she turned it and laced her fingers through his with the same confident naturalness she had used since the first time in Cormac's back room, and the evening settled around them like something permanent. "Yes," he said, "completely." The stars came out over the Arizona desert one by one, the way they always did, in the patient order of things that do not hurry because they have nowhere else to be. And Peter Rourke and Myrtle Fairchild Rourke sat on their porch and watched them appear, and said nothing more, because everything that needed saying had been said, and everything that needed proving had been proved, and what remained was only this: the long, certain, luminous quiet of two people who had found each other in the dust and the difficulty of the world and had decided, with full knowledge of what that meant, that they would not let go,